Sloane Whitaker never expected her quiet Christmas Eve shift to start with a shivering stray dog at the diner door. She chose kindness over rules. The next morning, the city's most ruthless billionaire, Thatcher Vance, arrived with a demand that would shake her world. One act of mercy was about to collide with a tightened search for the only thing he had left. Before we start, your support means everything to us. Like, comment, and subscribe so we can create more stories like this. Let's dive into this tale now. The biting chill of a Chicago winter rattled the windows of the Silver Spoon Diner as Sloane Whitaker wiped down the counter for the 10th time that evening. Outside, the city was vanishing under a thick blanket of white, and the streetlights flickered like dying stars against the relentless storm. It was Christmas Eve, a night meant for family and warmth, but Sloane was alone, her only company being the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant siren of a snowplow. She paused to look at her reflection in the polished chrome of the coffee machine, seeing a woman who seemed older than her 24 years, her eyes carrying the weight of a million unbuilt dreams. Just 3 years ago, she had been the youngest rising star at a prestigious architectural firm, but the crushing weight of her father's medical bills had forced her to trade her drafting pens for a serving tray. Her boss, Mr. Henderson, had already left to be with his grandchildren, leaving Sloane to close up. "You are a hard worker, Sloane, but do not let this diner become your whole world," he had told her before stepping into the snow. She touched the corner of an old architecture magazine tucked under the register, its edges frayed from years of longing. She imagined the skylines she should have been building, structures of glass and light that could withstand any storm, but the reality was the cold scent of dish soap and the ticking of the clock. Every cent she earned went toward debt and survival, leaving her in a cycle of invisibility. She was a hidden gem buried in the heart of a frozen city, waiting for a chance to shine again. The diner was a sanctuary for others, but for her, it felt like a beautiful cage where time had stopped moving entirely. She felt the deep isolation of the city pressing against her spirit as she worked through the night, yet she remained hopeful for tomorrow. As Sloane finally reached for her heavy winter coat to lock the door, a sudden movement near the base of the entrance caught her eye. She saw a heart-wrenching sight that made her breath hitch in her throat. Huddled in a deep snowbank was an elderly golden retriever, his fur matted with ice and his large body shaking from the sub-zero temperatures. He looked completely exhausted, as if he had been wandering for hours in the blizzard, his eyes filled with a silent plea for help. Sloane knew the diner had an incredibly strict no-pets policy, and that Mr. Henderson was a man of iron rules. But she could not let this creature perish in the Arctic wind. "I cannot just leave you out there to freeze, little one. You deserve better than this," she whispered while fumbling with the heavy locks. She pushed the door open against a powerful gust of freezing wind that sent snowflakes dancing across the floor. The dog looked up with fear, his tail giving a weak, pathetic wag. Sloane reached out, speaking in a melodic tone to soothe his nerves. "It is okay. You are safe now. I have got you," she said, as she gently coaxed him across the threshold. Once inside, the dog collapsed on the floor, the heat causing the ice on his coat to melt into small puddles. Sloane wrapped her coat around his shivering frame, guiding him toward the clanking radiator. She noticed his collar was expensive leather, but lacked any identifying tags. "I will call you Buster for now," she murmured gently. Sloane Whitaker knelt on the hard linoleum floor of the Silver Spoon Diner as the radiator let out a rhythmic series of clanks and hisses. The dog she now called Buster rested his heavy head on her knees, and his breathing began to slow into a deep and steady rhythm that echoed the peace she felt in her own chest. She reached out with a trembling hand to stroke his soft and velvet ears, which were still cold from the biting Chicago wind that continued to hammer against the large glass windows of the restaurant. Sloane looked into his soulful and liquid eyes and saw a reflection of her own life. Both of them were lost, and both of them were seeking a place to belong in a city that often felt too large and too indifferent. "You are going to be just fine, Buster. This diner is warm and safe, and we have everything we need to wait out the fierce storm that is raging outside these four walls tonight." Her voice was like a soft melody that seemed to weave through the empty booths and the polished countertops. She felt a strange and profound peace settle over her as she realized she was a woman of architecture who could see the invisible structure of his fear, and she began to build a solid bridge of safety for him with every gentle touch. She stood up slowly and walked over to where she had hung her heavy and worn winter coat. She laid it down on the floor right next to the heat, and she watched with a small smile as Buster settled onto the fabric with a deep sigh of relief. The wind howled, and the snow piled up against the front door, but inside the air was thick and comforting, with the lingering scent of vanilla and sweet fried onions. She noticed his eyes beginning to close, but she knew his stomach was empty. She turned her attention to the dark and quiet kitchen that lay behind the swinging doors. 4. Sloane entered the stainless steel kitchen where the equipment shimmered under the dim emergency lights. She checked the walk-in freezer and found a single prime steak that was destined for a morning special. She knew that Mr. Lee was a man of iron rules who did not believe in charity, but she also knew that a life was worth more than a piece of meat. She walked back out to the old-fashioned register and pulled out her small and precious pile of coins and crumpled dollar bills. It was exactly $30, which represented the total of her tips from her long and exhausting shift. She rang the amount into the machine with a firm press of the keys because she wanted to be honest. "I am paying for this fair and square, Buster. We do not take what is not ours even when we are in desperate need, and I want you to know that your meal is earned." She returned to the grill, and the sudden sizzle of the meat filled the room with a savory aroma. She cut the steak into pieces, and she sat back down on the floor. Buster ate with a slow gratitude while Sloane shared a small crust of bread with him as they sat together in the golden light. They sat on the linoleum floor as the radiator hissed and clattered. The world outside was white and vast, but here, in this 1 square foot of Chicago, life was perfect. This was her joy. As Buster drifted into a deep sleep by the clacking radiator, Sloane Whitaker felt the creative fire that she had tried to extinguish for 3 long years flicker back to life in her soul. She reached across the counter and grabbed a thick stack of white paper napkins and a plain black pen, and she sat in the corner booth, where the golden glow of a hurricane lamp cast long and dramatic shadows across the table. Her hand moved with a precision and a grace that belonged in a high-rise studio, as she began to sketch the intricate skeletons of glass towers and the flowing lines of a sustainable community park that she had been designing in her mind. Since the day she lost her career, I have not forgotten how to build a world, Sloane Whitaker, even if the world seems to have forgotten about me for a while. Her whisper was soft and fierce, as she detailed the complex load-bearing structures and the delicate cantilevered roofs that once earned her the title of architectural prodigy at her former firm. Each stroke of the pen was a revelation of her hidden genius, showing that she was a woman built of steel and vision, who was currently trapped in a world of coffee refills and side work. She looked down at the pile of napkins that were now covered in the blueprints of her heart, and she realized that her talent was not a ghost, but a living and breathing force that demanded to be seen by the light of day. One day these designs will be more than ink on a napkin, and I will stand among the clouds once again. She held the pen firmly as her heart swelled with a quiet and beautiful resilient hope. The first light of Christmas morning arrived with a pale and fragile gold that spilled across the fresh and untouched snow outside the large glass windows of the Silver Spoon Diner. Sloane Whitaker opened her eyes slowly as the warmth of the sun touched her face, and she found herself waking up in the corner booth where she had spent the entire night watching over her unexpected guest. The air in the restaurant was still and quiet, but the fierce and arctic howling of the blizzard had finally settled into a peaceful and rhythmic hush that felt like a blessing over the city of Chicago. She looked down at the floor and saw Buster stretching his long and golden limbs while his tail thumped against the linoleum with a steady and joyous beat that made her heart swell with a profound and quiet relief. "Merry Christmas, little one. We made it through the night, and you look like a brand new dog today." Her voice was husky with sleep, but filled with a genuine and beautiful warmth that echoed through the empty restaurant as she climbed out of the booth. She realized that her simple and selfless act of shelter had been a total success because the dog was no longer a shivering and broken creature, but a vibrant and happy companion who watched her every move with liquid eyes of devotion. Sloane began to move with a renewed and steady purpose as she cleared the stack of napkins from the table and tucked her architectural sketches safely into her bag for the day ahead. She felt a strange and powerful sense of peace, knowing that she had chosen kindness over convenience, and she began to tidy the diner as the time for the grand opening approached. She watched the clock on the wall and realized that her quiet and humble world was about to collide with the rest of the city as the snowplows began to roar in the distance. "I am ready for whatever this day brings, Sloane Whitaker, because a heart that knows how to protect a life is a heart that can never be truly defeated by any storm." She stood tall as the first coffee began to brew, and the scent of hope filled the air while the simmering peace of the night began to shift into the boiling energy of the morning. The city was waking up, and the stage was now set for a confrontation that would change her existence forever. As she straightened her apron and prepared to open the heavy doors to a brand new world that was waiting just beyond the frosted glass of the diner, she could feel the gears of fate turning in the silent corners of the room as she wiped down the stainless steel counters until they shimmered with a bright and silver promise. Everything was pristine, and the long night of isolation was finally over as she turned on the main lights and smiled. The peaceful hum of the brewing coffee was suddenly shattered when the heavy glass doors of the Silver Spoon Diner were thrown open with a violent force that sent a freezing gust of wind whistling through the warm room. Sloane Whitaker turned her head quickly, and her breath caught as she saw a tall and imposing figure silhouetted against the bright and blinding snow of the Christmas morning. It was Thatcher Vance, the legendary and ruthless billionaire known across the city of Chicago as the Titan of Steel, but the man standing before her now looked nothing like the cold and polished image that graced the covers of every major business magazine. His dark and expensive wool coat was dusted with white, and his hair was uncharacteristically disheveled, as if he had spent the entire night battling the elements without a single moment of rest. He was clutching a stack of bright red reward posters in his gloved hands, and his eyes were bloodshot and frantic as they scanned every corner of the small and humble restaurant with a desperate intensity. The quiet and shimmering atmosphere of the morning was instantly replaced by a high-stakes energy that made the air feel electric and heavy with the weight of an untold crisis. "I am looking for a dog. A golden retriever who went missing during the peak of the blizzard yesterday. Please tell me that you have seen him because he is the only family I have left in this world." His deep and commanding voice was cracked with an uncharacteristic vulnerability that vibrated through the empty booths and made Sloane Whitaker heart hammer against her ribs with a sudden and intense realization. Thatcher Vance did not wait for a formal reply as he stepped deeper into the diner, and his eyes finally locked onto the corner by the clacking radiator where Buster was beginning to rise from his makeshift bed. The billionaire froze in his tracks, and the stack of papers he was holding slipped from his fingers and scattered across the linoleum floor like giant red autumn leaves. "Duke, oh my God, Duke, is it really you?" The sound that came from his throat was a choked and raw sob of pure and unfiltered relief that shattered the ruthless facade he had spent a lifetime building. Sloane watched in silence as the most powerful man in the city dropped to his knees without a single thought for his tailored charcoal trousers, and she saw the elderly dog run toward him with a joyous and frantic bark. The transition from a cold and calculating executive to a broken and grateful man was a revelation that shook Sloane to her core. You found him. You actually kept him safe when the whole world seemed to be falling apart under the weight of the ice. He looked up at Sloane with eyes that were no longer steel but human and full of a profound gratitude that changed everything forever, starting now. The billionaire Thatcher Vance remained on the cold linoleum floor of the Silver Spoon diner, and his expensive charcoal trousers were now forgotten as he buried his face in the thick and golden fur of the dog he called Duke. The elderly retriever was whining and licking the billionaire's face with a frantic and joyous energy that seemed to bridge the gap between their two very different worlds. Sloane Whitaker stood behind the counter, and her hands were clasped tightly together as she witnessed a level of raw and unfiltered emotion that she never expected to see from the man known as the Titan of Steel. Thatcher pulled back slightly, and his hands were trembling as he gripped the dog's face and looked into his liquid and loving eyes. "You are safe now, Duke, and I am never letting you out of my sight again, because you are the only living piece of my father that I have left in this entire world." This revelation hung in the air like a fragile and beautiful chord of music, and it changed the entire atmosphere of the diner from one of a standard business transaction to something deeply personal and sacred. Thatcher looked up at Sloane, and his eyes were glistening with a moisture that he did not try to hide, as he realized the magnitude of what she had done for him. "My father passed away only 4 months ago, and this dog was his constant companion and his best friend for 12 long years, and I felt like I was losing him all over again when Duke disappeared into the blizzard." Sloane felt a lump form in her throat as she heard the honesty in his voice, and she realized that the ruthless billionaire was just a man who was mourning a great loss. The power dynamic in the room shifted instantly, and Sloane no longer felt like a simple waitress in a stained apron, but like a guardian who held the most precious asset in the city. I did not know his story, but I could see that he was loved, and I knew that someone was out there searching for him with a broken heart. Her voice was steady and kind, and it served as a bridge between her humble reality and his immense wealth. Thatcher stood up slowly, and he kept one hand on Duke's head, as if he were afraid the dog might vanish into thin air if he let go for even a single second. "People call me the Titan of Steel because they think I am made of something that cannot break, but you saw me at my weakest point today, and you treated a stray dog with more dignity than most people treat their own partners." He looked around at the worn booths and the polished chrome, and he saw the diner for what it truly was, which was a sanctuary of genuine human decency in a city of cold transactions. Sloane smiled. Sloane Whitaker stood back with a quiet and dignified posture, and her eyes were fixed on the touching scene of the reunion while the morning sun continued to brighten the small interior of the Silver Spoon diner. She felt a wave of relief wash over her as she realized that her instincts had been correct, and that this beautiful animal was truly the center of someone's universe. Thatcher Vance stood up slowly, and he spent a moment adjusting his coat, but his gaze never left Sloane's face, as he tried to reconcile her humble appearance with the extraordinary kindness she had shown his dog. "You have no idea what you have done for me today, and I need to know exactly how you managed to keep him so calm and healthy during the worst storm of the century." His voice had regained some of its resonance, but the sharp edges of his corporate authority were now softened by a genuine and deep curiosity. Sloane smiled gently as she gestured toward the clacking radiator and the makeshift bed she had created from her own winter coat. "I did not do anything special. I simply saw a life that was in danger, and I gave him a warm corner and a sympathetic ear, because everyone deserves a place to hide when the world turns cold." Thatcher looked down at the radiator and then back at Sloane, and he noticed the small, empty bowl where the steak had been served. "The manager told me that this place has a strict policy against animals, so how did you manage to keep him fed without getting into trouble with Mr. Henderson?" Sloane felt a brief moment of hesitation before she answered, because she did not want to sound like she was seeking praise for a simple act of decency. "I paid for his meal myself with my tips from the night before because I believe that some things are more important than a bank balance, and Duke looked like he needed a good meal more than I needed the extra cash." Thatcher Vance went perfectly still, and his analytical mind began to process the fact that this woman had spent her hard-earned money on a dog she did not even know. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather checkbook and a gold pen with a swift and advanced motion. "The reward for Duke's safe return is $50,000, and I want you to take it right now because you have earned every single penny and more." He began to write the numbers with a flourish, but Sloane Whitaker reached out and gently placed her hand over the paper to stop him. "I did not save Duke for a paycheck, and I cannot accept your money because a life saved is a reward in itself, and I would do the same thing again tomorrow for any creature in need." Thatcher Vance looked at her with a profound and stunned silence. "Right." Thatcher Vance stood in the center of the Silver Spoon diner, and the gold pen remained frozen in his hand as he stared at Sloane Whitaker with a mixture of total disbelief and a rising sense of profound respect. He had spent his entire adult life in a world where every smile and every favor had a hidden price tag, and where the acquisition of wealth was considered the ultimate metric of success. But this woman was standing before him in a simple apron and challenging his entire reality with a single gentle gesture. He slowly closed his leather checkbook, and his gray eyes searched her face for any sign of a hidden motive, but he found only a clear and unwavering integrity that made his own immense fortune feel suddenly small and insignificant in comparison. "I have spent 20 years building an empire on the belief that everyone has a price and that money can solve any problem, but you are standing here and proving me wrong without saying a single word about your own needs." His voice was a quiet rumble that seemed to fill the space between them with a new kind of weight, and Sloane could see the gears of his analytical mind grinding to a halt as he tried to process a person who was motivated by nothing but basic human decency. She stood her ground with a calm confidence, and her hands remained resting on the counter as she looked back at him with a gaze that was neither intimidated nor impressed by his status or his billions. "Kindness is not a transaction, Thatcher Vance, and a life is not a commodity that can be bought or sold like a piece of real estate or a block of corporate shares, because if I took your money, I would be turning a moment of genuine connection into a business deal." Thatcher let out a long and slow breath as he tucked the pen back into his pocket, and he realized that he was no longer looking at a simple waitress, but at a woman of extraordinary character who possessed a wealth that he could never hope to accumulate through hostile takeovers or savvy market investments. "You are the first person in a long time who has looked me in the eye and seen a man instead of a bank account, and I find that more valuable than any reward I could ever put into writing for you today." He took a step toward the counter, and the atmosphere in the room shifted from one of intense conflict to a shared understanding that made the air feel light and full of a strange and beautiful possibility. "I came here today because I was desperate to find my dog, but I think I am staying here because I want to understand what kind of person chooses a freezing stray over $50,000. Sloane Whitaker smiled, and her soft nod confirmed that their hearts were finally aligned. Thatcher Vance turned to lead Duke toward the exit, but a sudden and sharp gust of wind from the poorly sealed front door swept across the corner booth and sent Sloane's stack of white paper napkins flying into the air like a flock of startled birds. Several of the napkins drifted across the floor and landed right at the feet of the billionaire, who stopped mid-motion to reach down and retrieve the scattered pieces of paper before the melting snow could ruin them. He picked up the first napkin, and his breath hitched in his throat as his eyes locked onto the intricate and professional lines of a cantilevered roof structure that was drawn with a technical precision he had only ever seen in the most elite architectural firms in the world. He stood frozen in the center of the Silver Spoon Diner as he flipped through the other napkins, and he saw the complex load-bearing calculations and the revolutionary glass skeletons of a sustainable community park that were far beyond the YI capabilities of a standard draftsperson. What on earth is this? Because these are not just simple drawings, but the work of a master architect who understands the very soul of structural engineering and urban design. His voice was low and intense as he looked back at Sloane Whitaker with a shock that was even deeper than the relief he felt when he found his dog, because he realized he was standing in the presence of a hidden genius. Sloane felt a rush of heat color her cheeks as she realized her private world of ambition had been exposed to the most powerful man in the city, and she moved around the counter to collect her things with a panicked and quick efficiency. "Those are just some ideas. I had to pass the long and lonely hours of the night shift, and they are not meant for anyone else to see, so please give them back to me." Thatcher did not move as he held the napkins out of her reach, and his gray eyes searched her face with a professional fire that she had only ever seen in the boardrooms of his past life. "Do not lie to me, Sloane Whitaker, because I have spent 20 years building the tallest towers in Chicago, and I know the difference between a hobby and a calling, and these blueprints are the most innovative designs I have seen in a decade." He pointed to a specific detail on the largest napkin where she had solved a notorious wind load problem with a graceful and aerodynamic curve that was both beautiful and functional. "Who are you really? Because a woman who can solve the Michigan Avenue wind vortex problem on a napkin is not someone who should be serving coffee in a roadside diner on Christmas." Sloane looked down at the napkins and then back at Thatcher Vance, and she felt the secret she had been carrying for 3 years beginning to crack. "I am an architect, Thatcher Vance." Thatcher Vance stood in silence as he realized she was the true architectural visionary. Thatcher Vance stood in the shimmering light of the diner, and his fingers brushed the rough texture of the paper napkins as he looked at the woman who had just upended his entire understanding of talent and worth. He asked with a voice that was both a question and a quiet demand where she had received her training, because work of this caliber did not happen by accident. Sloane Whitaker looked at the stack of blueprints on napkins, and her voice was a soft whisper as she revealed that she had graduated at the top of her class from the Illinois Institute of Technology before becoming the lead designer at a D4 boutique firm in the city. "I spent 5 years poured into every steel beam and glass facade until my father fell ill with a condition that the insurance companies refused to cover, and the medical bills began to pile up like the snow outside." She paused, and her eyes grew distant as she explained that she had taken on extra shifts to pay for his care. But then a massive conglomerate had acquired her firm, and the new management had decided to downsize the most expensive and senior staff to maximize their quarterly profits. Thatcher felt a cold sensation in his chest that had nothing to do with the winter air as he asked the name of the firm that had let her go. Sloane looked him directly in the eye and said the name was Miller and Whittaker, and that she was the Whittaker who had helped build their reputation for 10 years. Thatcher Vance went perfectly still, and the air in the room became heavy with a revelation that made his heart hammer against his ribs, because he knew that name very well. His company, Vance Industries, had completed the hostile takeover of that exact firm 6 months ago, and he had personally signed the documents that ordered the restructuring and the immediate termination of the highest earners. You were the primary architect for the North Harbor project, and your name was on every single document that I reviewed during the acquisition process. Yet I never bothered to look at the person behind the brilliance. He realized that the ruthless efficiency he had championed had crushed the life of the very woman who had just saved the only thing he truly loved in this world. Sloane watched the color drain from his face, and she realized that the man standing before her was not just a billionaire, but the architect of her own professional ruin. The irony was a sharp and painful edge that cut through the silence of the Christmas morning as they stood between the clacking radiator and the smell of fresh coffee. Thatcher looked at his dog and then back at the woman in the stained apron, and he knew that he had to fix the broken structure of her life. I am the reason you are here today, Sloane Whittaker. Thatcher froze. Thatcher Vance stood in the heavy and suffocating silence of the Silver Spoon Diner, and the weight of his own corporate legacy felt like a physical and crushing burden on his shoulders as he realized the cruel and biting irony of the situation. He looked at the ink-stained napkins in his hand and then at the brilliant woman who had spent a freezing night in a roadside diner because of a cold and calculated decision he had made in a glass skyscraper many miles away. I did not realize that my pursuit of cold efficiency was destroying the very human talent that made this city great. And I cannot leave this restaurant knowing that your genius is being wasted behind a stainless steel counter while I build my empire on the backs of people I never even bothered to meet. His voice was a low and urgent rumble that carried the weight of a sincere apology and a new kind of professional determination that Sloane Whittaker had never heard from a man of his status. Sloane Whittaker felt a powerful wave of conflicting emotions wash over her because she was looking at the man who had stolen her professional future, but also the man who was currently weeping over a dog she had saved from the snow. She asked him with a voice that was edged with a justified and sharp bitterness what he could possibly do now that the damage was already done and her career was a pile of cold ashes. Thatcher did not flinch as he stepped closer and looked her directly in the eye with a professional intensity that was now tempered by a deep and personal respect. I am not just offering you a humble job, Sloane Whittaker, because that would be a total insult to your talent, but I am inviting you to a private consultation at Vance Industries headquarters tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. He explained that he wanted her to bring every napkin and every scrap of paper she had ever sketched on, because he needed her to see the blueprints of the project from a brand new perspective. Sloane felt a familiar and sharp pang of hesitation, because she had been burned by the corporate world once before, and she did not know if she could trust the Titan of Steel with her dreams ever again. I have spent 3 years learning how to survive in the shadows, and I do not know if I am ready to step back into the light of a world that discarded me when I was at my most vulnerable point. Thatcher Vance reached out and gently touched her arm with a sincere and steady hand as Duke sat at their feet and watched them with liquid eyes. You saved the only thing that matters to me in this world, and now I am asking you to let me save the things that matter to you. Sloane nodded, and she felt hope. The following morning arrived with the city of Chicago looking like a polished diamond under the crisp winter sun, and Sloane Whitaker stood before the imposing glass and steel facade of the Vance Industries headquarters, feeling a mixture of terror and determination. She was wearing her one remaining charcoal wool suit, which she had kept perfectly pressed in a garment bag for 3 long years, and she felt the weight of her old life returning as she stepped through the revolving doors into the soaring Rupenides marble lobby. The atmosphere was one of quiet and efficient power, where the air smelled of expensive perfume and success, and she saw the high-level executives moving with a speed that she had almost forgotten. She was acutely aware of her own humble path from the diner, but she held her head high as she approached the security desk and prepared to give her name. To her total surprise, she did not have to say a word, because Thatcher Vance was already standing in the center of the lobby, with Duke sitting patiently at his side, as if they had been waiting for her since the first light of dawn. The billionaire was dressed in a navy suit that cost more than the diner, and his presence commanded the attention of every single person in the massive room, yet his eyes were only for her. "I promised you that we would step back into the light together, Sloane Whitaker, and I am here to make sure that the world sees you exactly as I do, which is as the true heart of this company." His voice was a calm and steady force that silenced the whispers of the gathered staff, and he reached out to offer her his arm in a gesture of profound and public respect. They began to walk toward the executive elevators, and Sloane could feel the eyes of her former colleagues on her as she moved past the reception desk where she had once been treated like an invisible employee. As the elevator doors opened on the 43rd floor, she saw a man standing by the window who made her blood run cold, because it was Mr. Sterling, the manager, who had personally signed her termination papers and stolen her original concepts for the North Harbor project. He turned with a smug and arrogant smile that vanished the moment he saw Sloane standing next to the most powerful man in the city. "Mr. Sterling, I believe you are already acquainted with Sloane Whitaker, but I suggest you look at her very closely, because she is the new lead architect on the skyscraper project, and she will be the one reviewing your performance from this moment forward." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow, and Sloane watched as the color drained from the face of the man who had tried to destroy her future, while Thatcher guided her toward the massive double doors of the boardroom. The double doors of the boardroom swung open, and Sloane Whitaker stepped into a space that felt like the world's summit, with floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the frozen lake. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of leather and cold corporate ambition, as 15 senior partners looked up from their tablets with expressions of naked curiosity. Sloane did not hesitate as she walked to the center of the massive mahogany table and began to lay out her white paper napkins with a steady hand that belied the pounding of her heart. Mr. Sterling let out a sharp and mocking laugh as he leaned back in his chair with a sneer of total contempt. "These are just garbage napkins from a greasy spoon diner, Thatcher. Why are we wasting our time with a failed waitress who cannot even afford a proper portfolio?" He looked around the room for support, but the billionaire Thatcher Vance remained perfectly still, with a gaze that was as sharp as a diamond. Thatcher reached out and picked up the central napkin, showing the cantilevered roof design that had baffled the firm's engineering team for months. "These napkins contain the structural solutions you claimed to have invented last month, Mr. Sterling, but you could never explain the mathematics behind the curves because you stole the soul of this project from the woman standing before us." Today, the revelation hit the room like a seismic wave, and the partners began to whisper as Thatcher pulled up a digital access log on the main screen, showing that Mr. Sterling's credentials had been used to delete Sloane's name from the original archives 6 months ago. "I have spent the last 12 hours tracing the digital footprints of your deceit. and I am firing you immediately for professional fraud and intellectual theft." The atmosphere shifted from tension to a total and absolute vindication as security guards appeared at the door to escort the disgraced manager from the building. Thatcher turned to Sloane with a look of profound respect, and he addressed the room with a voice that was full of a new and powerful conviction. "I am officially appointing Sloane Whitaker as the lead architect for the Chicago skyscraper project, because she is the only person in this city with the vision to build something that is as resilient as her own spirit." Sloane felt the heavy weight of her 3-year exile finally lift as she looked at the blueprints of her heart spread across the table, and she realized her career was no longer a ghost, but a living reality. She stood at the head of the table, and her voice was a clear and steady bell of authority. "We are going to build a landmark that the people of this city will be proud of, and we will do it with the integrity that this project has lacked until this second." Every partner in the room stood to applaud her, and she knew she was finally home. The professional atmosphere at Vance Industries shifted into a high-energy montage of intense creativity and technical precision as Sloane Whitaker and Thatcher Vance began to work side by side on the city's landmark skyscraper project. Late nights in the executive suite became the new normal, where the golden glow of high-resolution monitors and the soft rustle of vellum paper replaced the cold silence of the boardroom. Thatcher watched as Sloane translated the soul of her napkin sketches into digital models, and her hands moved across the keyboard with a technical mastery that made him realize he had hired a true visionary. "I have spent my entire life looking at buildings as simple financial assets, but you make me see them as living organisms that need to breathe and serve the people who walk through their doors every single day." Thatcher's voice was a low murmur of sincere admiration as they stood over a 3-dimensional printed model of the tower's complex base. Sloane looked up from the intricate blueprints, and her smile was a soft reflection of the moonlight, hitting the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the massive office. "A building without a profound purpose beyond quarterly profit is just a hollow shell. Thatcher and I want to build a structure that remembers the heart of the city and respects the hard-working people who live within its shadows." Their intellectual respect grew into a deep and personal bond as they spent 80 hours every week debating everything from the tension of the suspension cables to the placement of the lush internal vertical gardens. Duke was a constant and comforting presence in the office, and he often slept by Sloane's desk, just as he had by the clacking radiator in the diner, serving as a living reminder of the kindness that had brought them together. One evening, as the snow began to fall again over Lake Michigan, Thatcher stopped her work to point out at the shimmering and vast skyline. "I thought my father left me a vast empire to rule, but I am starting to realize he left me a heavy responsibility to protect, and you are the one teaching me how to do that through your brilliant designs." Sloane felt a surge of warmth that had nothing to do with the office heating system, as she looked at the man who was no longer just the ruthless titan of steel. They were 2 architects of a new world building, a future that was stronger and more resilient than any skyscraper they could ever design in their lives. The transition from professional collaboration to a deeper and more meaningful partnership was seamless and inevitable, as they shared a vision that cut through the corporate fog of Chicago. Thatcher leaned over the table, and his eyes were full of a new and shimmering hope as he spoke with total honesty about how her presence made him feel. The silence of the executive suite was broken only by the rhythmic and muffled drumming of a fresh blizzard against the reinforced glass, as Thatcher Vance stood motionless by the window, looking out at the city he had spent his entire life trying to conquer. The Chicago skyline was once again a ghost world of swirling white and freezing shadows, but inside the air was thick with a new and shimmering vulnerability that had nothing to do with architectural blueprints or corporate strategies. Duke was lying contentedly at their feet, his breathing a steady and grounding presence that reminded them both of the night their paths first collided in a humble roadside diner. Thatcher turned to look at Sloane Whitaker, who was still seated at the drafting table, her face illuminated by the soft and golden glow of the desk lamp, and he realized that the wall he had built around his heart was finally beginning to crumble into dust. I used to believe that the only way to protect my father's legacy was to become the Titan of steel that the world expected me to be, because I thought that showing even a single ounce of compassion was the same thing as showing a fatal weakness in a world of sharks. His voice was a quiet and raw confession that vibrated through the vast room, and he finally admitted that his ruthless reputation was nothing more than a defensive structure he had erected after his father's sudden passing 4 months ago. He stepped away from the window and toward the woman who had seen the man behind the mask on a night when he was at his most broken and desperate. I watched my father give his entire life to his employees and his community, only to see the vultures circle the moment his heart began to fail, and I swore that I would never let anyone get close enough to hurt me or the empire he left behind. But then I saw you with Duke in that diner. Sloane stood up slowly, and her eyes were full of a deep and beautiful understanding, as she realized that his arrogance was just a shelter for a profound and lingering grief that had gone unaddressed for far too long. I used to think that the Silver Spoon Diner was a place where my life had come to a dead end, but I realize now that it was actually the most important classroom I have ever attended, because it taught me that resilience is not built in a boardroom, but in the quiet moments when we choose to help someone who has nothing to give us in return. She walked toward him, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet, and she spoke with a voice that was a clear and steady bell of truth that seemed to echo against the glass. You do not have to be the Titan of steel every second of the day, Thatcher, because a building that cannot bend in the wind is a building that is destined to break, and the same thing is true for a human heart that has been under too much pressure. The atmosphere between them shifted from professional respect to an intimate and profound connection as they stood together in the heart of the storm. I have spent millions of dollars on security systems and ironclad contracts, but none of them ever made me feel as safe as I do standing right here in this office with you tonight. We are building a future together, Sloane, and I am finally starting to see that you are my home. The following morning arrived with a crisp and clear sky that shimmered over the city, and Thatcher Vance drove Sloane Whitaker away from the polished glass towers of the financial district and toward the weathered brick streets of her old neighborhood. He parked his massive black car in front of a sprawling and vacant lot that was currently a desert of gray slush and rusted chain-link fences, but Sloane could see the invisible potential of the space instantly. They stepped out of the vehicle, and the biting wind of Chicago pulled at their coats as Thatcher gestured toward the empty land with a look of intense and quiet pride. I have spent my entire life buying land to build monuments to my own success, but I spent yesterday morning purchasing this lot in your name because I wanted to give you a place to build a monument to your own heart. The revelation hit Sloane like a powerful and beautiful seismic wave, and she looked at the man who was no longer a cold corporate titan, but a true partner who understood the deepest longing of her soul. Thatcher pulled a rolled document from his pocket, and he handed it to her with a steady and sincere hand that showed his complete and total faith in her genius. I want you to take every single idea you sketched on those napkins at the Silver Spoon Diner, and I want you to build the most advanced and beautiful community center this city has ever seen right here where it is needed the most. Sloane felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she realized that he was not just funding a building, but he was validating the years she spent in the shadows of the diner. I spent 4 years serving coffee across the street from this lot, and I watched the families here struggle with nowhere to go and nothing to call their own, and I used to dream of building them a sanctuary, but I never thought I would have the resources to make it real. She looked at the vacant land, and she could almost see the glass walls rising from the dirt, and the vertical gardens breathing life into the brick landscape, just as she had imagined during her lonely night shifts. The Silver Spoon was not a dead end for you, Sloane Whitaker. It was a foundation, and now I want to see what kind of world you can build when you have the full power of Vance Industries standing behind every single one of your dreams. Thatcher stepped closer, and his voice was a low and resonant promise that cut through the winter chill with a warmth that was more powerful than any furnace. You taught me that the most important structures are the ones that provide shelter to those in need, and I realized that my empire was a hollow shell until I met the woman who knew how to give it a soul. Sloane opened the roll of paper, and she saw the official city permits already stamped with her name as the lead architect and director of the project. We are going to change the skyline together, Thatcher, but more importantly, we are going to change the way this city thinks about its people, and that is the greatest design of all. They stood together on the frozen ground, and the atmosphere was no longer one of cold corporate transactions, but of a shared and radiant purpose that was destined to rewrite the history of Chicago. Duke barked with a joyous and bright energy as he ran through the slush, and Sloane realized that her act of Christmas Eve kindness had finally come full circle to build a future for thousands of people she had once served in silence. Thatcher looked at her, and he knew that he had finally found the missing piece of his own legacy in the eyes of the waitress who refused to be broken. The grand opening of the Chicago skyscraper project was only 1 week away, and the air at the very summit of the towering structure was thin and crisp as Sloane Whitaker and Thatcher Vance stood together on the private observation balcony. Below them, the city of Chicago was a vast and shimmering tapestry of gold and sapphire lights that stretched toward the dark horizon of Lake Michigan, while the wind of the high altitude whistled softly through the custom aerodynamic vents. Sloane had designed on a paper napkin months ago. The atmosphere was one of quiet and breathtaking triumph, because the glass and steel giant they had built together was no longer just a digital model, but a living landmark that had redefined the entire skyline. Sloane leaned against the reinforced glass railing, and she felt the steady vibration of the building's heart, which was a testament to her own resilience and her refusal to remain invisible in the shadows of the diner. Thatcher stepped up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, while Duke sat contentedly between them, his presence a grounding reminder of the snowy night that had changed the trajectory of their lives forever. I spent 10 years trying to reach the top of this city alone, and I thought that the view would be enough to satisfy my ambition, but I realize now that the height means nothing if you do not have someone standing beside you who truly understands the cost of the climb. His voice was a low and resonant confession that carried more weight than any corporate speech he had ever delivered in his life, and Sloane felt a deep and radiant warmth spread through her chest. She turned in his arms to face him, and the reflection of the city lights danced in her eyes as she looked at the man who had become the strongest foundation in her world. I used to look up at these buildings from the window of the Silver Spoon Diner, and I felt like a ghost haunting a world that had no room for me. But you saw through the apron and the struggle to the architect I was always meant to be. She reached up to touch the lapel of his coat, and her voice was a clear and steady bell of love that seemed to echo against the vastness of the night sky. You did more than just give me back my career, Thatcher. because you gave me back my belief that integrity and kindness are the only materials worth using when you are building a life that is meant to last." Thatcher looked down at her with a gaze that was full of an intense and shimmering devotion, and he realized that he was finally looking at a future that was not built on hostile takeovers or aggressive market shares, but on a partnership of equals. "I came to that diner on Christmas morning looking for a lost piece of my past, but I found the entire blueprint for my future in the eyes of a woman who chose mercy over money." He pulled her closer, and the silence between them was a sacred and profound recognition of two souls who had survived their own separate storms to find a shared sanctuary in the clouds. "I love you, Sloane Whitaker, and I promise to spend the rest of my life making sure that your vision is never silenced and your heart is always sheltered by my own." Sloane smiled, and the kiss they shared at the top of the world was the ultimate seal on a merger that was far more important than any business deal in the history of Vance Industries. They stood together as the masters of the skyline, knowing that the greatest structure they had ever designed was the love that now held them together with a strength that could never be broken by time or tide. The morning of the grand opening for the Whitaker-Vance Community Center arrived with a sky so blue and clear it looked like polished glass, reflecting the collective hope of a neighborhood that had waited decades for a sanctuary of its own. 6 months had passed since the blizzard, and the gray slush of the vacant lot had been replaced by a stunning structure of curved steel and transparent walls that seemed to grow out of the earth like a living organism. The atmosphere was electric, with the joyful noise of a community reborn as hundreds of families gathered on the new plaza, where the air was sweet with the scent of blooming winter roses and the promise of a fresh start. Sloane Whitaker stood at the base of the soaring entrance she had first designed on a paper napkin, and she felt a profound wave of emotion as she watched children running through the open doors and toward the light-filled library she had insisted on building. She was no longer the invisible waitress in a stained apron, but a celebrated visionary wearing a tailored suit of emerald silk that matched the vibrant vertical gardens climbing the exterior of the building. Thatcher Vance stood beside her, his hand resting firmly on the head of Duke, who looked younger and healthier than ever as he wagged his tail at the passing crowd with a joyous and bright energy. The billionaire looked at Sloane with a pride so deep it was visible in every line of his face as he realized that this building was the true legacy his father would have wanted for their family name. "I spent 20 years building towers that reached for the sky, but today I realize that the most important work I have ever done is helping you build this foundation for people who finally have a place to call their own." His voice was a resonant and steady force that carried across the plaza, and Sloane felt a radiant warmth spread through her chest as she prepared to step up to the podium to address the city. She looked out at the faces of the people she had once served in silence at the Silver Spoon Diner, and she saw her own resilience reflected in their hopeful eyes. 3 years ago, I thought my voice had been silenced by the cold winds of corporate greed. But this building is proof that kindness is the most durable material in the universe, and that a single act of mercy can change the entire trajectory of a life. Her voice was a clear and steady bell that seemed to vibrate through the very steel of the structure as she officially dedicated the center to the spirit of Chicago. She revealed to the cheering crowd that the center would offer free architectural and engineering workshops for local youth, ensuring that the next generation of dreamers would never have to hide their genius in the shadows of a diner. Thatcher leaned in and whispered that he had already established a scholarship fund in her name to support those students, further cementing the bond they had built on that snowy Christmas Eve. The transition from her past struggle to this moment of total public vindication was complete, as the ribbon was cut and the doors were opened wide to a future that was as bright as the morning sun. We did it, Thatcher, and we did it by remembering that every life matters and every story deserves a home. They stood together as a unified force of integrity and love, knowing that their greatest design was finally a reality that belonged to the people. The sun began to set behind the soaring and graceful silhouette of the new community center as Sloane Whitaker and Thatcher Vance walked slowly together through the winding paths of the lush park they had built from a once-forgotten lot. The Chicago sky was painted in deep shades of violet and crimson, while the fresh evening breeze carried the distant laughter of families still enjoying the sanctuary of the vertical gardens and the glowing glass halls. Duke trotted happily ahead of them, his golden coat shimmering in the fading light as he explored the soft grass and the modern fountains that were now a permanent part of the city he had nearly lost forever in a blizzard. The atmosphere was one of profound and shimmering peace, because the heavy storm of their separate pasts had finally cleared to reveal a world that was pristine and full of endless and beautiful possibility. Thatcher stopped at a secluded stone bench that overlooked a small reflecting pool, where the architecture of the center was mirrored in the still and clear water. He reached into the pocket of his dark navy coat and pulled out a small and elegant velvet box. But he also held something else that was far more precious, which was the very first white paper napkin that Sloane had used to sketch her dreams. In the Silver Spoon Diner, he had it preserved in a thin and archival glass frame, so it would never fade or crumble, just like the love that had grown between them during the long and intense months of their shared labor. I carry this with me every single day because it is a reminder that the most revolutionary things in this world do not start in boardrooms or with massive capital investments, but they start with a person who has the courage to be kind when nobody else is watching. His voice was a low and resonant whisper of total and absolute devotion as he handed her the framed napkin and then slowly dropped to one knee on the pristine path, while Duke sat beside him as a silent and faithful witness to the ultimate merger of their two hearts. Sloane Whitaker, you are the most brilliant architect I have ever known, and the most resilient soul I have ever met, and I am asking you to let me be the foundation for the rest of your life, so we can build a future that is as magnificent as the skyline we created together. Sloane felt a surge of joy that was so powerful it seemed to vibrate through the very earth beneath her feet as she looked down at the man who had transformed from a ruthless billionaire into a partner who valued her soul above any corporate asset. She saw the classic and stunning diamond ring in the box, which looked like a tiny fragment of the stars they had stood among on the skyscraper balcony, and she realized that her act of mercy on a cold Christmas Eve had led her exactly where she was always meant to be. I spent 4 years thinking I was a ghost, but you were the one who saw through the shadows to the woman I was always meant to be, and I would be honored to build a life with you, Thatcher Vance, because you are the home I never thought I would find again. She reached out to take his hand, and her voice was a clear and steady bell of truth that signaled the end of her exile and the beginning of a legacy that would be defined by integrity and grace. Thatcher stood and pulled her into a deep and protective embrace, while the first stars began to appear over the park, reflecting in the glass of the community center that would now stand as a testament to their love. They were no longer two strangers trapped in a storm, but two architects of a brand new destiny, knowing that the greatest structure they had ever designed was the heart they now shared with a strength that could never be broken by time or tide or any storm. They walked home together under the shimmering city lights as the masters of their own beautiful and kind and perfectly built future. If Sloane and Thatcher's journey reminded you that no storm lasts forever, please give this video a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support is the foundation that allows us to keep building these stories for you. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you are always there when the next great story begins. Share this journey with someone who feels lost in the shadows right now. Remind them that their life can change in a single night, because sometimes the greatest skyscraper in the world starts with a simple act of mercy, a humble napkin, and the courage to let someone see the genius you have been hiding. Thank you for listening.